Hey everyone, this is Jordan Ramirez. I know a lot of things have been happening since I have been on hiatus from my podcast. I want to congratulate the WGA that led the more than 5-month strike against the major studios in Hollywood. Although I don't know the details of what they each got in return, at least for now, the writers of your favorite movies, television shows, and late night shows are already back at work. The SAG-AFTRA strike, however, still continues. Since there has not been any movement between the negotiating parties, we will have to see what happens next. Both these two strikes were still part of the continuing summer of strikes across the country. Recently, we have the strikes against the top automakers in the country, including General Motors. What I can say about this is that it has nothing to do with money as part of the reason why they are on strike. It's because of the eroding wealth inequality gap that has been going on for more than 20 years, and that capitalism has made things worse for their own special interests rather than the benefits and safety of their own employees, who do not have the same luxury as the CEOs of these major corporations. I just hope that we can all learn something from this, that you need to think about others as well as removing the corporate influence that has not only plagued some of the biggest companies in the United States, but also in other industries across this big country, whether it's sports, medicine, entertainment, journalism, labor, etc. It is a problem that will not go away instantly, but will take years and time to rebuild. And speaking of the entertainment industry, have you guys ever read this amazing article that I found from Vulture about Rotten Tomatoes? It is an amazing dive into the machinations of this influential website that, as their function goes, quote, it can make or break them, with implications for how films are perceived, released, marketed, and possibly even greenlit. The tomato meter may be the most important metric in entertainment, yet it's also erratic, reductive, and highly and easily hacked, end quote. It is an amazing read that I would highly recommend to my listeners if you are interested in learning about the powerful influence of this one website. I could also tell you about what is happening now in independent filmmaking, or what Martin Scorsese said in an interview with GQ magazine about the state of the film industry, but I will reserve that for my Allow Me to Explain segment instead. So, because I have been on hiatus for almost 5 months, I can tell you that Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez is back, and you can still listen to my podcast every Monday and Friday on Spotify. Since it's my first episode back on the podcast, today's film review is the absurdist comedy Smoking Causes Coughing from 2022, followed by my segment Allow Me to Explain. And now, as they say, on with the show. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is Smoking Causes Coughing, released in 2022, directed by Quentin Dupieux, starring Gilles Lelouch, Vincent Lacoste, Anaïs de Mostier, Jean-Pascal Sadi, Oloya Amamra, and Alain Chabet. Here is the synopsis of the film. There is a superhero group in France named the Tobacco Force. Benzene, nicotine, ammonia, mercury, and methanol. Their main job, to defeat the bad guys and save planet Earth. And I am sure that you have heard of this line before, since it is central to almost every superhero movie. Well, on their most recent outing of defeating their recent foe, the Tortoise, their leader, Chief Didier, played by Alain Chabot, a rat puppet, has told them they are being sent out to a retreat to work on their team building skills, since their previous battles showed a lack of cohesion in their teamwork. So the Tobacco Force are out in the woods for their retreat to work on their teamwork cohesion so that they can fight off their next biggest foe, Les Audins. So what do I think of this film? To paraphrase filmmaker John Waters, it is a superhero movie for idiots. I would call it the best superhero movie ever made. Quentin Dupieux is at it again with his creative and absurdist imagination that led him to create this film. This is the third Quentin Dupieux film that I have covered for this podcast, the previous two being Mandibles from 2020 and Deerskin from 2019. This one I find to be both engaging and farcical, with a plot that feels like an adolescent child could have conceived this as a feature film, but with greater expectations than one has ever seen before. So, picture a Super Sentai show like Power Rangers mixed in with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, then add something like a horror anthology show, say Tales from the Crypt or maybe Masters of Horror, and this film is the end result. One of the main motifs I have noticed watching this film is the usage of cigarette smoking in this movie. From the beginning of the film that opens with a song about smoking cigarettes entitled God Smokes Havana, sung by Catherine Deneuve and Serge Gainsbourg, without a hint of irony. It is also seen again in one scene where the father of a young boy watches the tobacco force fight against the main bad guy with a cigarette dangling from one side of his mouth, to a story involving an aunt giving her lit cigarette to what's left of her nephew in the car. Okay, I will explain what I meant by that last bit. So in this film, there are at least 2 or 3 different stories that are shown in the movie. The first involves 2 couples renting a country home, and one of the couple's wives finds a thinking helmet that ends with a bloody conclusion. The second, pretty short, is about a fish that discovers through its shock and horror someone dumping toxic waste in its water. The third and final story focuses on the manager of a lumber mill trying to rescue her nephew from a machine that has already damaged his legs, but ends up getting chopped into bits with the exception of his mouth that is still alive. This last one was told to by a talking barracuda. The performances in the film are spectacular, based on how each of the characters are portrayed from beginning to end. Benzine, portrayed by Giles Lelouch, is the main leader of the Tobacco Force superhero team, sort of like Tony Stark, except he's more selfish of himself in this movie. Methanol, played by Vincent Lacoste, tries to be the most mature member of the group, but instead acts like a jerk. Mercury, played by Jean-Pascal Zadi, is the only parent of the group, who has a wife and 2 kids, and I think is the only member who I feel should have more attention in this film. Ammonia, played by Oloya, Amamra, and Nicotine, played by Anaï Demostier, are the only 2 female members of the group, and I think one of my favorite scenes with these 2 characters is when Nicotine feels sad that Chief Didier is out with another woman at his place, but Ammonia tells Nicotine of a scenario involving her and Chief Didier in bed with this repulsively disgusting goo that comes out of his mouth, and now Nicotine doesn't think about a romantic life with Chief Didier that is both hysterical and somewhat idiotic to watch. The other credits in the film are the editing and cinematography, also by Quentin Dupieux, besides his credits as writer and director. The costumes for the Tobacco Force in the film were created by Justine Pierce that are in 3 colors, blue, silver, and yellow. The production design for this film was also created by Quentin Dupieux's wife, Joan Leboroux, for the creation of the Tobacco Force's retreat in the woods and other set pieces that occupy most of the film. I love the animatronic practical effects that were created in this film by Gustav Hogan and Simon Northcott that feels reminiscent of the pre-CG days when you watch Sentai shows involving men inside rubber suits costumes as the monsters that the heroes fight up against, and the rat puppet that was operated and voiced in the film by Alan Chabot. When Quentin Dupieux was making this film in the writing process, he stated that he didn't know anything about superhero films. Quote, "When I was still living in Los Angeles, I went to a movie theater with my son to watch an Avengers movie. I think it was the first Avengers. I don't know. It was a nightmare for me. The sound, the noise, the explosions, the loud music, the editing, everything was a nightmare to me. So I think at this point I stopped. I was like, no, this is not for me. And the movie we are talking about today is it's like the reverse of this. It's slow, the pace is okay, there's no aggressive music. What can I say about superhero movies? Are you still watching these movies? It's impossible." For the casting of the film, Dupieux stated that he needed famous actors to finance his own movies. Quote, "I actually need them or their talent, but also because, in a way, they validate the movie by being here. They say to the audience, we think this director has something to say. You know what I mean? The same movie with only unknown actors suddenly will be hard to promote." End quote. Regarding the horror-style anthology structure in which the heroes are around a campfire, Dupieux stated that his idea, quote, "was to create a new structure, something that goes in different places. That's why I explored storytelling. It was the main idea at the start of the writing, to create a new storytelling structure, and it became the subject of it. It became a story about people telling stories." End quote. The film was previously screened at the Cannes Film Festival last year. It was released in March of this year in the United States. If anyone asks me what the point of this film is and what is its message, my response is, there is no point. There is no message. This is not a parody or a spoof or a satire. It is an absurdist, surreal superhero film that outweighs the tedium of the current Hollywood blockbuster machines that are made today. I think of this film as an anti-superhero film that doesn't need big budgets and CG that makes you feel emotionally distant. It instead relies on fun, absurdity, talent, and creativity over profit, and working together as a team. That is what I got from this film. It is a film that I highly recommend to anyone who has not seen a film just like this. We will be right back with my segment, Allow Me to Explain. There were a lot of stories that I had a hard time of keeping track during my hiatus from the podcast. So, for this segment, I thought that I would get to delve in some news in the entertainment industry about what Martin Scorsese said in an interview for GQ magazine while promoting his latest feature, Killers of the Flower Moon, for saving cinema from the comic book movies and the blockbuster franchises. Another story that was under the radar that caught my attention is a story about the lack of funding for theatrical distribution companies and options for independent feature films. So it's time for Allow Me to Explain Entertainment Edition. For me, it feels like it has been years since I have last done a segment regarding the entertainment industry and what has been going on lately. But right now, in this age of streaming movies and television shows that has made the tech giants feel empowered, it seems to me that cinema is being treated as nothing more than a corporate playground for a business rather than as a creative process that other countries are taking very seriously. And for once, I am not going to do a news story regarding the phenomenon of Barbenheimer. I know that I have not seen either of those films and it had gotten a lot of buzz, but I'm not going to do that. So instead, I am going to talk about something that has been on the news for almost maybe more than a few weeks, Martin Scorsese and the current state of Hollywood. Yes, I am going to be talking about this. Since it may not seem like news, I just couldn't help it. So for those who do not know what I am talking about, it goes like this. Martin Scorsese was recently interviewed by British GQ magazine for the September 25th issue. The article focuses on the director himself and his entire career up until his most recent feature. But what mostly caught the attention of almost every entertainment news outlet was this. When the interviewer was asking about the current state of Hollywood making nothing but movie franchises and comic book movies, he said this: "The danger there is what it's doing to our culture, because there are going to be generations now that think movies are only those. That's what movies are." He also added in response, they already think that, which means that we have to then fight back stronger. And it's got to come from the grassroots level. It's got to come from the filmmakers themselves. And you'll have, the Safdie brothers, and you'll have Chris Nolan, you know what I mean. And hit him from all sides. Hit him from all sides, and don't give up. Let's see what you got. Go out there and do it. Go reinvent. Don't complain about it. But it's true, because we've got to save cinema. Scorsese also had an issue with the streaming industry in Hollywood. No, I don't want to say it, but what I mean is that it's manufactured content. It's almost like AI making a film. And that doesn't mean that you don't have incredible directors and special effects people doing beautiful artwork, but what does it mean? What will it give you? Aside from a kind of consummation of something and then eliminating it from your mind, your whole body, So what is it giving you? I would have to say that for once, I agree with Scorsese on this one. Well, let's not forget that this is not the first time that he went up against the Marvel machine. Back in 2019, Scorsese wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that was not meant as an attack on the Marvel film directors or its films, but instead was an attack on the system. Quote, "I don't think they're cinema. I was asked a question about Marvel movies. I answered it. I said that I've tried to watch a few of them and that they're not for me. That they seem to me to be closer to theme parks than they are to movies as I've known and loved them throughout my life." End quote. Now, that op-ed did upset not only fans of the Marvel movies and its directors, including James Gunn and Taika Waititi, but also to Marvel's CCO Kevin Feige, who responded by saying, quote, "I think it's unfortunate. I think myself and everyone who works on those movies loves cinema, loves movies, loves going to the movies, loves to watch a communal experience in a movie theater full of people." End quote. Now, that was back in 2019. Fast forward to 2023, and there is an op-ed headline that would read like from why I think Martin Scorsese is wrong about superhero movies to Joaquin Phoenix saying that he does not agree with Martin Scorsese by saying in an interview with Cinema Blend, quote, I think they make some great fun movies. There's nothing wrong. I'm not a fucking cinephile. I'm not a snob, and I'm totally fine with, I enjoy those movies sometimes, and I think they keep the fucking industry going in some ways, so I don't have a problem with it at all, end quote. Well, to be honest, I have to agree with Martin Scorsese on this one too. I mean, that was what I watched when I was younger. Nowadays, I feel like the special effects in some of the more recent superhero movies look so regressive and artificial that I cannot see myself watching any more of these films, since audiences would have to keep with whatever is going on with the plot or whatever story they're watching. And it does somewhat become tiresome with the same repetitive storylines, unfunny jokes, and plot devices that somewhat feel contrived, or some of the meta humor that to me feels like they just literally killed comedy. But I think what people are missing from this is the big picture about the state of Hollywood and where it is headed. So let's go back to that 2019 op-ed, for instance. Okay, so Scorsese broke it down into two sections. Why I don't like Marvel movies, that's one, and why Marvel movie scares me, that's two. Scorsese's argument is that the main problem with Marvel movies is that the studios have changed the goal of their mindset to just make more movies instead of taking chances of risks, which is what worried Scorsese, who often avoids repeating himself. His statement reads like this, quote, in many places around this country and around the world, franchise films are now your primary choice if you want to see something on the big screen, end quote. Some of the biggest franchise moneymakers in 2019 that made billions of dollars alone were 3 Marvel movies and 1 DC movie. Remakes and sequels also dominated that year from Disney and Universal. The Lion King, Toy Story 4, Fast and Furious Presents Hobbs and Shaw, etc. According to Scorsese, movie studios interpret those box office returns as an indication factor of what audiences want, meaning that studios would take less of a risk in terms of original stories or smaller movies that won't be able to make it big at the box office. The success of these franchise movies has shaken up the market in the United States for directors wanting to make smaller movies, since audiences are more inclined in favor of seeing big franchise movies when they go out to movie theaters across the country and the globe. Another reason that Scorsese has an issue with is the film industry's inability to figure out how to get people to go to the movies. Quote, if you are going to tell me that it's simply a matter of supply and demand and giving the people what they want, I'm going to disagree. It's a chicken and egg issue. If people are given only one kind of thing and endlessly sold only one kind of thing, of course they're going to want more of that one kind of thing, end quote. What Scorsese would mean in this scenario is, take a movie like Avengers Endgame from 2019, which opened to a record number of theater screens at 4,662 on its opening weekend, while original films like Jordan Peele's Us or Once Upon a Time in Hollywood opened on nearly a few thousand theater screens across the country. According to Tim Rothman, chairman of Sony Pictures, the way that studios have to get audiences to see a movie in theaters is what he calls theatricality. Quote, there now has to be something about it that gives it that theatrical urgency. And it's true whether it's a small budget horror film, a gigantic event film, or a mid-budget original drama, end quote. Marvel was able to figure out how to use that theatricality to their own expense. So how do smaller movies compete with the big giants? Marketing is the answer. Crazy Rich Asians, for example, became a milestone by featuring an all-Asian cast that was not seen for more than 25 years. On the other hand, a film like Booksmart from 2019 did not achieve its milestone. While it was raved by audiences and critics as a can't-miss comedy, it only made $24 million worldwide. The culprit to blame? Annapurna Pictures and its lack of, or inability to take advantage of their own marketing that led to its low box office returns. The problem with Hollywood isn't that people are not going to see more Marvel movies than anything else. It's that the rest of the industry is not able to adapt the habits of contemporary moviegoers, since they believe that movies are too expensive to see in theaters or that studios have not been able to use their marketing strategy seriously for their own target audience that makes them feel left out, or the fact that audiences would prefer to watch movies at home instead of watching them in theaters. While someone might criticize Scorsese for being hypocritical in the idea that some of the recent Marvel movies would feature protagonists of color or women in the lead, and that the majority of the films that Scorsese made featured only white male protagonists might be considered questionable, I would say that you are missing the big picture entirely. He is not only just a filmmaker, but he is also a producer on a number of films that featured filmmakers of color than Marvel, as well as women. Let's not also forget that this is also the same Martin Scorsese who founded the World Cinema Project, which is part of the Film Foundation, whose goal is to preserve and restore films that were neglected or shown in the United States, now having their due since it's now part of the Criterion Film Collection. You have to give ethos and credit to Scorsese for bringing films that help to bring in new audiences behind the scenes. Without his contribution, some of these films would never see the light of day, or be seen to a wider audience who want to have their own films and their own voice from their respective countries being shown. Scorsese is not just a filmmaker who looks at the past, he has also seen films of the present and what new filmmakers can achieve. Going back to that GQ article, he was asked about how his influence of filmmaking and history can be seen in contemporary cinema nowadays. He said, quote, "Yeah, I see some camera moves, but I usually see story, atmosphere. Definitely there's that influence in a lot of stuff. I've seen some that were so much that I have to stop watching them. Not that I look at a film to learn something, but in effect, I'm not going to learn anything from this. You don't put a film on to learn something, but in the process of watching something, you might come away from it enlightened. I can't put it into words, but you're enlightened in another way," end quote. An example to describe his point, Archipelago from 2010, directed by Joanna Hogg, quote, "That was a revelation, and since then I've been lucky enough to have helped produce her other films. I wasn't looking at it to learn, but I did learn, and I think partially, like a lot of the style that I have now, or not style, but the approach to filmmaking now has a lot to do with seeing films like that," end quote. I will let Scorsese have the last word when it comes to repetition in terms of camera moves, angles, and so on. Quote, "The point is, why do them? It's now become part of the language, and also, do I have to prove that I can do a really beautiful camera move, like in Goodfellas? Well, I did it. Do it again? No. It doesn't pay. It really doesn't, because that was good for that moment, you know? There are people now you can stitch things together, and there are people who do it incredibly beautifully. But I'm not interested in the technique of, how should I put it, the technical aspect of it. I'm interested in ultimately the accumulation of images, you see? The accumulation of people, and what's going on with the people. But there are people who do these things now. Camera moves? Come on. So they're doing everything. I gotta do something else. I gotta go somewhere else," end quote. This ends part 1 of my Allow Me to Explain Entertainment Edition segment. We will be right back for part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of Allow Me to Explain Entertainment Edition. While I have been talking a lot about what got the most attention in the entertainment news, here is a story that did not gain a lot of attention in this week's news. Independent cinema right now is facing a dire future, and this is coming from a panel at the Woodstock Film Festival entitled Current and Future State of Independent Cinema. The panel featured Bob Burney, the CEO of Picture House, John Sloss, founder and CEO of Cinetech Media, and Eugene Hernandez, director of the Sundance Film Festival and head of public programming. Sloss discussed in the panel that while the streaming giant Netflix had been a game changer for independent filmmakers, it has also proven to be regressive with the streaming giant's decision to withhold data from the industry at large. Independent films lost the opportunity to have their films theatrically released during the pandemic, since streaming services has now become a priority for their own platforms. Sloss admitted that he was drawn to Netflix when they began to acquire independent films 2 decades ago. Quote, "I have 70 films in my office that pay overages, which is not an insignificant amount. Then Netflix came in, and it was really a conflict because they were paying so much money. From everyone's standpoint, it was like, do I stick up for the theatrical and all the media and the possibility of making money on the back end and betting on myself? Or do I just take this windfall and give it to them for perpetuity?" End quote. Bernie, who previously worked at Amazon Studios, noted that there were mixed attitudes of streaming services when it came to theatrical releases. On one hand, Netflix is still committed to their films being released theatrically. On the other hand, a majority of other streamers have used their films to streaming-only content. This is one of the challenges that independent cinema is facing in its struggle to find a home for these platforms. Eugene Hernandez and the panel discussed about the difficulty of selling independent films in the current market. Quote, "I was talking to a distributor the other night who told me that a sales agent came to him and basically said, 'Hey, we've got like all these films that didn't sell from the festivals this past year, and we are literally going to give them to you for no guarantee up front so you can get them out into the theaters.' And the distributor said, 'I don't want to put the marketing money in, so we are not going to do it.' So there are these films being offered to distributors for no money whatsoever, and the distributors are saying no. What does that say about rebuilding that theatrical marketplace for independent films?" End quote. Even though independent films are facing a dire situation at this moment, Sloss noted that the Until about a year ago, if you were going to sell a film to Netflix and you had already sold to Danish TV, you basically had to go buy back the Danish TV rights because they needed to hoover up every medium in every territory around the world in perpetuity. So I think that aspect of them is moving in the right direction." End quote. And to bring it on home, I will let John Sloss have the final word from that same panel regarding the future of independent cinema in the age of streaming. Quote, "There's an interesting sort of three-dimensional chess game occurring with the platforms now where you can see people like a Max licensing programming to Netflix, and it's actually increasing its viewership on Max. There's another related phenomenon, which is, even though it's a reflex for the streamers to want to buy something in perpetuity, if you really press, they will tell you that the practical value of it to them is at most 18 months. Because they're not really library players. To the extent the people who do what we do can take advantage of that and the willingness to license to their competitors, then maybe the future is about selling films to someone like Netflix for 18 months instead of perpetuity, and then creating the aftermarket and the possibility for profits and just expanding viewers around the world by taking it off that platform and licensing it in other places." End quote. This has been a special Allow Me to Explain Entertainment Edition segment. On the next episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, it's a Jordan Ramirez minisode. Jordan Ramirez recommends The Story of Temple Drake from 1933 starring Miriam Hopkins, airing Monday at 12 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public every Friday. And my minisodes Jordan Ramirez recommends every Monday at 12 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. And just as a reminder to make sure to like and subscribe to my podcast on Spotify. Make sure to go to my blog website at Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez podcast.wordpress.com with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. Check out my YouTube channel as well, Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, and please make sure to like and subscribe. And for the first time on my podcast, I'm going to do a special video podcast guest star experience. What this means is that if you submit your favorite film or a recommended film that you want me to talk on the show, instead of having me talking about it, I want the guest who submitted this film either on the Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez podcast Facebook page or maybe you could submit it on Instagram or on YouTube. I will have that opportunity to make sure that I interact with my guest, not just as an audio podcast, but also as a video podcast as well, so that you can see yourself on the small screen. So make sure to submit your recommended favorite film, whether it is a mainstream film, an obscure film, a classic film, or an international film, and then maybe, just maybe, you would have the experience of being a guest host or a guest star on my podcast. So make sure to submit your recommended film either on the Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez Facebook page, or maybe an audition video on Instagram or on YouTube. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.